What you're about to discover has fascinated theologians, historians, and biblical scholars for centuries. A mysterious group of beings known as the Watchers appears only briefly in Scripture, yet their story has shaped Jewish tradition, early Christianity, and countless theories about humanity's earliest history. Who were they? Why did they rebel? And why does the Bible mention them so sparingly? To answer these questions, we must return to one of the most mysterious passages in all of Scripture. Genesis chapter 6 opens with just a few verses that have generated thousands of years of debate. It reads, "The sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose." Shortly afterward, Genesis introduces the Nephilim, described as mighty men of old, men of renown. The identity of these sons of God has been debated for centuries. One traditional interpretation holds that they were the descendants of Seth, Adam's righteous son, who intermarried with the descendants of Cain. Another interpretation, found in many ancient Jewish writings and embraced by several early Christian writers, identifies them as angels who abandoned their appointed place. This second interpretation is where the story of the Watchers begins. The term Watchers does not appear in Genesis itself. Instead, it comes from the Book of Enoch, an ancient Jewish work written several centuries before the time of Christ. Although 1st Enoch is not included in the biblical canon of most Jewish and Christian traditions, it was highly influential during the Second Temple period and is still considered canonical by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. According to 1st Enoch, a group of about 200 heavenly beings descended to Mount Hermon under the leadership of Semjaza. They swore an oath together and chose to rebel against God's command. Their decision changed the course of human history. Enoch says these Watchers taught humanity knowledge that people were never meant to possess at that time. Azazel allegedly taught the making of swords, shields, armor, and weapons of war. Others taught astrology, enchantments, sorcery, cosmetics, metalworking, and forms of divination. Whether these accounts are understood literally or symbolically, the message is clear. Forbidden knowledge was associated with moral corruption rather than wisdom. According to Enoch, the offspring of these unions became giants known as the Nephilim. These giants brought violence, oppression, and widespread destruction across the earth. Genesis itself gives very little detail, but it immediately follows this account, with God's declaration that humanity had become profoundly corrupt. Soon afterward comes the story of Noah and the flood. Many scholars see a deliberate literary connection between these events, even though Genesis does not explicitly explain every detail. The New Testament also contains intriguing references that many believe point back to this ancient rebellion. 2 Peter chapter 2 speaks of angels who sinned and were cast into gloomy chains until judgment. Likewise, Jude verses 6 and 7 describe angels who did not keep their proper domain, but abandoned their own dwelling. Jude immediately compares their actions with the sexual immorality of Sodom and Gomorrah. These passages have led many scholars to conclude that the authors were referring to the same tradition preserved in 1st Enoch. In fact, Jude directly quotes 1st Enoch in verses 14 and 15, making it the only non-biblical Jewish work explicitly quoted in the New Testament. This does not necessarily mean the entire book was considered scripture, but it does demonstrate that its ideas were well known among early Jewish and Christian audiences. The question remains, why are the Watchers mentioned so briefly in Genesis if their actions were so significant? Many biblical scholars suggest that the original audience already understood the tradition, making lengthy explanations unnecessary. Over time, however, much of that cultural background faded, leaving modern readers with only a few enigmatic verses. The influence of the Watchers extends far beyond theology. Ancient civilizations across Mesopotamia, Greece, and the Near East preserved stories about divine beings interacting with humanity. While these traditions differ significantly from the biblical account, historians often study them together because they reflect common ancient themes about heavenly beings, forbidden knowledge, and the consequences of human pride. It is important, however, not to confuse historical comparison with historical proof. Similar stories do not necessarily demonstrate that the same events occurred. They simply show that these ideas were widespread throughout the ancient world. Theologically, the story of the Watchers emphasizes an important biblical principle. Knowledge without obedience can become destructive. Throughout Scripture, wisdom is portrayed not merely as possessing information, but as living according to God's will. The problem was never knowledge itself. The problem was rebellion. The Watchers, according to this tradition, crossed boundaries that God had established. Instead of protecting creation, they corrupted it. Instead of guiding humanity toward righteousness, they contributed to violence, pride, and moral collapse. That pattern echoes throughout the Bible. Humanity repeatedly chooses independence over obedience, power over humility, self-exaltation over faithfulness. Whether one accepts the Watchers as literal fallen angels, symbolic figures, or another interpretation entirely, their story serves as a warning about the misuse of authority and the consequences of crossing moral boundaries. For many believers, the central message is not about hidden creatures or mysterious giants. It is about the reality of spiritual rebellion and humanity's constant need for redemption. After the flood, the biblical narrative shifts its focus away from the Watchers and toward God's covenant with Noah, then Abraham, ultimately leading to Israel, the prophets, and finally, Jesus Christ. The Bible does not dwell on the darkness. Its larger story is one of restoration, yet the mystery remains. Why does Genesis devote only 4 verses to an event that later traditions describe in such extraordinary detail? Why do Peter and Jude revisit this ancient rebellion? And why has the story continued to captivate scholars, theologians, and readers for more than 2,000 years? Perhaps because the Watchers represent something larger than themselves. They remind us that every generation must decide what it will do with knowledge, power, and freedom. The greatest mystery may not be who the Watchers were. The greatest mystery is whether humanity has truly learned the lesson their story was meant to teach.